There was a body under my bed, but nobody believed me. I was 12 years old when it happened. I'd been sorting through my marble collection, counting them one by one, when my tiger's eye marble rolled under the bed. Without thinking twice, I reached under to grab it. That's when my hand brushed against hers. At that age, the only hands I'd ever held were my parents' when I was much younger. I knew right away what I had touched. Cold, lifeless fingers. I yanked my hand back so fast, scooting into the far corner of my room. After I managed to calm myself, I got down on all fours and peeked under the bed. What I saw left me frozen. Her eyes, the bluest eyes I'd ever seen in my life. Even now, I've never seen anything like them. The next thing I remember was waking up to my parents' worried faces staring down at me. My sister, Sarah, said I let out a blood-curdling scream and passed out right after. When I came to, the memory hit me all at once. I told my parents there was a body under my bed. Naturally, they thought I was making it up. It was just a bad dream, they said. Your imagination's running wild. But I wouldn't let it go. I was so insistent that they finally agreed to check. I sat huddled on the couch while they searched. My hands covered my ears, and I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the scream I was sure would come from my mom. But it never did. I opened my eyes just a crack to see them standing in front of me again, looking more annoyed than concerned. They scolded me for pulling such a ridiculous stunt, and that was the end of it. My parents weren't the kind to entertain nonsense, especially my dad. Their frustration made me start to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. That night, I avoided my room as long as I could. But when bedtime came, the look my dad gave me told me I'd better not push my luck. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped inside. Everything looked normal, felt normal, even smelled normal. I let out a shaky breath, changed into my pajamas, and climbed into bed. Exhaustion from the day's events took over, and I fell asleep faster than I expected. But it wasn't peaceful. I spent the whole night tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares of those piercing blue eyes. In my dreams, they followed me everywhere, on every face I saw. Crowds of people surrounded me, grabbing at my clothes, pulling at my arms, their mouths moving like they wanted something from me. I woke up with a jolt, drenched in sweat. The room was still dark, and the sun hadn't risen yet. A heavy sense of unease hung in the air. I knew I had to check again. Better to face it now than let it eat at me all day. I reached into my bedside drawer, fumbling around until my fingers found my flashlight. I gave it a firm smack to get it working and braced myself. Telling myself it was all in my head, I slid off the bed and crouched down. This time, I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I just stared. She was still there, the same woman with those awful blue eyes. Her body was twisted and bloody, but it was her expression that rooted me to the spot. Her face was frozen in terror, helpless and desperate. I half expected her to lunge at me, like in the horror movies I wasn't supposed to watch. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't even seem alive. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, shaking and crying. I begged the universe to tell me why this was happening and how I was supposed to fix it. The next morning, I dragged myself to the kitchen, groggy and red-eyed. My mom was making breakfast, her back to me, when my dad snapped, asking what on earth had happened to my face. That's when I realized everyone was staring at me. My mom said my eyes were puffy and crusty from crying. My sister, Sarah, thought it was hilarious and made some snarky comment about me looking like garbage, earning a sharp glare from my dad. Without thinking, I told them it was the woman under my bed. Before I could say anything else, my dad cut me off. He wasn't the type to tolerate backtalk, and once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that this so-called prank was over. That morning, the house went silent. No one spoke a word to each other, and we all just went about our routines. I knew better than to bring it up again around my dad. But school? That was a different story. Joey, my best friend since kindergarten, didn't even hesitate to believe me. He was always my go-to guy, and as soon as I told him, we started brainstorming. "She's gotta be some kind of ghost," he said. rubbing his chin like he had an invisible beard. Joey had been obsessed with the supernatural since we were 5 years old. "But I felt her hand," I said. Joey went on to explain that not all ghosts are just some misty, floating figures. He had a way of talking about this stuff like he was an expert, and honestly, I didn't fully understand what he was saying. Still, his explanation sounded better than thinking I was hallucinating. Joey decided she must be a lost soul, stuck here for some reason. But why she'd chosen me, of all people, to show herself to, that was a mystery. I mean, my biggest concerns back then were collecting Pokemon cards and leveling up in video games. I wasn't exactly cut out to help a ghost find the light, or whatever it was she needed. That would mean I'd have to look under the bed again, and somehow figure out how to talk to her. Did I need to call a priest? Should I get a Ouija board? Would my parents even let me? Questions like that bounced around in my head all day. When I got home from school, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. Nobody else was home yet. Mom and Dad worked late, and my sister, Emily, had cheerleading practice. Normally, I'd have a snack and watch TV for half an hour before starting on my homework. Dad was strict about chores and schoolwork being done before he got home, and he'd always check. But today was different. I had a mission. Standing in my room by the bed, I tried to summon up all the courage I had. I needed to figure out what she wanted. I needed to help her. I counted down from 10, dropped to the floor, and looked under the bed. The moment I saw her again, every bit of confidence drained out of me. She was still there, lying in that twisted position with the same expression of sadness and fear. But now her skin looked different. It had turned this sickly gray color, and in some spots, it sagged like it was ready to slide off her bones. Other areas were tight and stretched, especially on her face, making her look like a skeleton. I didn't know much about death back then, but I'd seen enough dead animals in the woods to recognize decay when I saw it. And then the smell hit me. It was a sweet, rotting stench that made my stomach lurch. I bolted for the bathroom, barely making it to the toilet before throwing up my lunch. By the time Emily got home, I cleaned up the mess, but that was about all I'd managed. She immediately noticed that none of my chores were done. "You know Dad's gonna lose it," she said, and I knew she was right, but I couldn't even step into my room without gagging. It was like seeing her rotting body had unlocked the smell, and now it filled every inch of the place. I explained what had happened, hoping she'd understand. Instead, I could see the irritation all over her face. "This is all in your head," she said with a sigh. "I'm gonna prove it to you." Before I could stop her, she marched straight for my door. Panicked, I ran ahead and threw myself against it, spreading my arms wide to block her. "Please," I begged, "don't open it." The door was barely keeping the smell contained, and even with it shut, the stench was leaking out through the gap at the bottom. Emily paused, looking at me like she wasn't sure what to believe. Her irritation gave way to concern. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away. Mom and Dad got home together a little after 6. We didn't have a family car, so Dad would use his work truck to pick Mom up on his way back from jobs. If Dad had to work far out, Mom would catch a ride with a coworker. Those days were rare but felt like a blessing. They gave us a little break from the tension and chaos Dad always brought home. Dad had barely stepped inside when his eyes locked onto me. My stomach twisted into a knot the second I'd heard the truck pull up in the yard, and now it felt like I was swallowing a rock. Before he could start yelling, I blurted out everything. About the decaying skin, the awful smell, and those piercing blue eyes. I hoped if I got it all out quickly, he'd understand. But I should have known better. Without a word, Dad grabbed me by the arm and dragged me toward my bedroom door. I could hear him muttering under his breath. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught "waste of my time" and "stupid kid." Those were two of his favorite things to say. He wasn't a man who held back when it came to showing his anger. When we got to my room, he threw the door open so hard it nearly came off the hinges. Still gripping my arm with one hand, he grabbed the bed frame with the other and lifted the whole thing, mattress and all, like it was nothing. Dad was a big, strong guy on any given day, but when he was angry, it was like he turned into a force of nature. I honestly believed he could have moved the entire house if he wanted to. I was sobbing and gagging from the smell, trying to make him see what I saw. Through my tear-blurred vision, I could still see her under the bed, lying there just like before. How could he not see her? Or smell her? Dad yanked me close, his face inches from mine. His voice was a low, menacing growl as he said through clenched teeth, "If you keep up this nonsense, there will be a body under this bed, and it'll be yours." After that, the house went quiet. That was always the pattern after one of Dad's outbursts. Nobody said a word, not that night, not the next morning. It was the same kind of silence we'd had the time he smashed the TV in a rage. Dad wasn't exactly what you'd call a caring father. We didn't have that close, all-American father-son bond you'd see on TV. He decided early on that I wasn't like him. I didn't have that same raw anger, and he'd written me off as hopeless. A lost cause, he called it. And even though the stench coming from under my bed was unbearable, I knew better than to push him any further. His temper scared me more than the dead girl under the bed ever could. That night, I barely slept. I spent the first couple of hours gagging, trying not to throw up again. Eventually, my body got used to the smell, but it didn't make things easier. Instead, it was the crying that kept me awake. My own quiet sobs, muffled into my pillow. I'd cry until exhaustion finally pulled me under, only to be yanked back into nightmares. The dreams were relentless. I'd see her face, pale and lifeless, every time I closed my eyes. When I woke up, drenched in sweat and tears, I'd start the cycle all over again. This became my new routine. Tossing, turning, crying, and gagging through the night, then dragging myself through the day like a zombie. My family could tell something was wrong, how could they not? But nobody dared to ask. Not with Dad around. I'd peek under the bed every now and then, checking to see if anything had changed. She was still there, rotting away, her body decaying in ways I couldn't put into words. I'd think to myself that if she kept decomposing, maybe she'd just disappear one day. Maybe she'd dissolve into nothing. But the nightmares didn't let me off that easy. They got worse. I started seeing her in the woods, running for her life. She wasn't jogging. She was sprinting, frantic, like something was chasing her. I could feel her fear, sharp and raw, as she darted around trees and over fallen branches. She'd look back, desperate, trying to see what was after her. That desperation, that sheer terror in her eyes, it's burned into my memory. I'd never seen fear like that before, not outside of movies. Well, except in the eyes of my family during one of Dad's worst rages. It was the kind of fear that comes when you know something terrible is about to happen and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. The dreams grew worse with each passing night. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I won't go into the details of what happened. It's not something anyone should ever have to picture. But even in the twisted, surreal nature of those nightmares, I could tell what I was seeing was rooted in something real. It was too vivid, too brutal. This woman had chosen me. She'd shown me what happened to her. But why? What could I possibly do? I started scouring local news sites, searching for any mention of someone who looked like her. Missing persons reports, unsolved murders, anything. But I found nothing. Each dead end made the weight of it all feel heavier. I started to believe this would end with me wasting away just as she was, trapped in a shared descent into nothingness. I could see the worry in my mom's eyes every day, but one glare from my dad was enough to silence any questions she might have dared to ask. My mom wasn't the kind of person to stand up to him, at least not openly. She was small and soft-spoken, a woman who did what she was told while he was looking. But in her own quiet way, she always found a way to help me. On nights when Dad would punish me by sending me to bed without dinner, she'd sneak me a plate in the early hours of the morning. Those small acts of defiance saved me, more times than I could count. And then one day it all stopped. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, the kind that makes it hard to believe bad things could happen. I hadn't checked under the bed in a while. By then, she wasn't much more than a skeleton, her body reduced to a grotesque shadow of what it once was. The only part of her that seemed untouched by decay were those hauntingly blue eyes. They never faded. I steeled myself, expecting to see that same empty gaze when I knelt down and looked beneath the bed. But instead, all I found was a water bottle, a pair of socks, and my old baseball mitt. She was gone. At first, I felt relief, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But that feeling didn't last long. It was quickly replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I knew she'd been real. I couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, but I knew. And I knew that whatever she'd gone through, it was real too. No one deserved to suffer like that. My family wasn't religious, but in that moment I prayed. I prayed that wherever she was now, she had finally found peace. As the day went on, that sadness started to fade, replaced by something else. Anxiety. A deep, gnawing unease. It didn't make sense. The nightmare was over, wasn't it? So why did I feel like something was still wrong? It wasn't until after lunch that my life changed in a way I never could have predicted. Mr. Cash, our principal, came to my classroom and told me to come with him. He didn't say why, but the serious look on his face made my stomach drop. I wasn't the best kid, but I'd never been sent to the principal's office before. As we walked down the hall, I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I could have done to get in trouble. When he opened the door to his office, I saw Jill sitting there. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. That's when I knew this wasn't about me. Mr. Cash, usually a cheerful man, looked grim. He said there'd been an incident, and that our aunt was on her way to pick us up. Jill immediately broke down, but I was frozen. My mind raced with questions. Why wasn't Mom or Dad coming to get us? Were they hurt? Had Dad hurt Mom? Before I could ask, Mr. Cash stood and walked toward the door. As he passed me, he paused, placing a hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. Then he left us there to wait. The room was silent except for Jill's quiet sobs. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, growing louder with each second. Soon, the pounding turned into a high-pitched ringing. Just as it became unbearable, the door swung open. It was our aunt. She didn't say much, only that there had been an incident and that my mom, my sister, and I would be staying with her for a while. Mom and Dad weren't hurt, she assured us, but she wouldn't explain anything more. Jill and I bombarded her with questions as she ushered us into the car, but she remained firm. Your mom will explain everything when the time is right, she said. Her tone left no room for argument, but it only made the pit in my stomach grow deeper. When we arrived at our aunt's house, we found Mom sitting stiffly on the couch. Her face was blank, but her swollen, red-rimmed eyes told me she'd been crying. The moment she saw us, her arms reached out, and we didn't hesitate. We collapsed into her embrace. I still didn't know what terrible thing had happened, but being in her arms felt like the safest place in the world at that moment. After what felt like an eternity in her hug, she pulled back and guided us to sit beside her, one of us on each side. She gripped our hands tightly, her expression full of pain. Slowly, her gaze shifted between me and my sister, and then she began to speak. Your father did a very, very bad thing, she said, her voice trembling. And he won't be coming home anytime soon, if ever. Her words hit me like a brick, but I couldn't process them fully. She went on, explaining that Dad had killed a woman in another state during one of his so-called work trips. She didn't share many details. She was trying to protect us, but what she did say was enough to make my stomach churn. To shield us further, our aunt cut off our access to the internet and cable. She said she didn't want us stumbling upon the gruesome details. Mom also told us we'd be staying home from school for at least the rest of the week, maybe longer. Normally, the idea of skipping school would have felt like a gift. But this wasn't a break. It was a nightmare. That night, when everyone else had gone to bed, I snuck into the living room. I needed answers. I turned on the TV and flipped through the channels until I found the local news station. It wasn't long before her face appeared on the screen. She was wearing a black cap and gown, her graduation photo displayed with her name underneath. Anna Elizabeth Collins. My ghost girl. She was only 19, barely older than my sister. The news anchor explained how Anna had fallen in with the wrong crowd after high school and often hitched rides with strangers to get around. Her body had been found by hikers deep in the woods. Dad and his work truck matched the description of the man last seen giving her a ride. The police had been watching him for weeks, waiting for him to slip up. They got the break they needed when they retrieved DNA from a cigarette he'd carelessly tossed. It was a match not just for Anna, but for 2 other missing persons cases as well. I stared at her picture, those ocean blue eyes shining even through the screen. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a sense of peace. Anna had suffered horribly because of my father, but I knew, somehow I just knew, that she was finally at rest. I turned off the TV and lay down on the couch, my mind a swirl of emotions. Eventually, sleep found me. That night, I didn't gag or toss and turn. There were no nightmares. Instead, I dreamed of standing in my room. Anna appeared in the doorway, but not as the decaying specter I had grown used to. This time, she looked just like the girl in the photos, radiant and serene. Her face was soft, angelic, and calm. She floated across the room, her presence filling the space with a warm, comforting light. She placed her hands gently on my shoulders and pulled me into an embrace. I didn't need words to understand what she was telling me. Life was going to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine, and it wasn't going to be easy. But in that moment, wrapped in her ethereal glow, I knew we would eventually be okay.